World War II didn't begin in Europe in 1939. It began 4 years earlier in Africa, and the world simply looked away. Ethiopia was one of only 2 African nations that had never been colonized by a European power. In 1896, Ethiopian forces did the unthinkable. They crushed an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa. It was the first time in modern history an African nation had defeated a European colonial power outright. For Italy, the defeat became a national wound, a humiliation that festered for nearly 40 years. By 1922, a new leader rose to power in Rome, Benito Mussolini, promising to restore Italian glory. Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire, stretching across the Mediterranean and deep into Africa. Avenging Adwa became more than strategy. It became a personal obsession for the Italian dictator. Italian newspapers began painting Ethiopia not as a sovereign nation, but as a prize waiting to be civilized. Throughout the early 1930s, Italy quietly built up its forces in neighboring colonies, Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Ethiopia, aware of the danger, appealed repeatedly to the League of Nations for protection. In December 1934, a border skirmish at Walwal left dozens dead and gave Mussolini the pretext he needed. The League of Nations opened an investigation. Mussolini didn't wait for the verdict. Despite being a founding member of the League, Ethiopia found itself with remarkably few allies willing to intervene. By October 1935, Mussolini's patience and the world's attention span had run out. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces crossed the border into Ethiopia without a formal declaration of war. It was one of the most lopsided conflicts of the 20th century before it even began. Italy fielded tanks, aircraft, and modern artillery. Ethiopia's army relied largely on rifles, spears, and sheer determination. Emperor Haile Selassie mobilized his people, calling on every able citizen to defend their homeland. Ethiopian soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, ambushing Italian columns in the mountainous terrain they knew intimately. But the technological gap was staggering, and Italy escalated with methods condemned even by the standards of that era. In direct violation of international protocols, Italian forces used chemical weapons against Ethiopian troops and civilians. The world knew, reports reached Geneva, and still no meaningful action followed. Emperor Haile Selassie personally led troops at the Battle of Mechu in March 1936. It was a desperate, valiant stand, but against overwhelming firepower, it could not hold. One by one, Ethiopian defenses collapsed under the weight of Italy's modern war machine. By early May 1936, Italian forces closed in on the capital, Addis Ababa. On May 5th, Italian troops entered the city. Mussolini declared victory and a new Roman Empire. Haile Selassie refused to surrender his throne. Instead, he chose exile, to fight the battle in a different arena. He boarded a train, then a ship, carrying with him not an army, but a plea for the world's conscience. In June 1936, Haile Selassie arrived in Geneva, Switzerland, home to the League of Nations. He came to address the very institution his country had trusted to keep the peace. Standing before delegates from around the globe, the exiled emperor spoke, not as a beggar, but as a prophet. "It is us today," he warned. "It will be you tomorrow." He described in detail the horrors his people had endured and the danger of a world that tolerated aggression. Some delegates applauded. Journalists called it one of the most powerful speeches of the century. But applause is not action. The League's response was symbolic sanctions, full of loopholes and almost never enforced. Oil, the one resource that could have crippled Italy's war machine, was never embargoed. The League of Nations had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of aggression. It failed its very first real test. For a young dictator watching from Berlin, the lesson was unmistakable. The world would talk, but it would not act. Adolf Hitler took note. If Ethiopia could fall with so little consequence, what else might the world allow? We'll be right back to see what happened to Ethiopia under occupation and who refused to give up. Italy declared Ethiopia part of a new colonial territory. Italian East Africa. But conquering the capital was not the same as conquering the country. Italian rule was brutal. Public dissent was crushed, and reprisals against civilians were severe. Yet almost immediately, a resistance movement emerged in the mountains and countryside. They called themselves the Arbegnoch, the Patriots, and they refused to accept occupation as permanent. Armed with little more than captured weapons and unmatched knowledge of the terrain, they waged a relentless guerrilla campaign. For 5 years, Italian forces never fully controlled the countryside they claimed to rule. International recognition of the conquest remained limited. Many nations quietly refused to acknowledge Italy's claim. Ethiopia's flag, technically defeated, never fully came down in the hearts of its people. Meanwhile, in Europe, the consequences of the world's inaction were accelerating. In 1936, Mussolini and Hitler formalized an alliance, the Rome-Berlin Axis. The two fascist powers had watched each other test the limits of international resolve and found there were almost none. Within 3 years, German forces would march into Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland. The pattern set in Ethiopia, aggression met with hesitation, repeated itself across an entire continent. But for Ethiopia's patriots, resistance was not about global politics. It was about home. Coming up, how a global war finally brought Ethiopia's liberation and what its capital represents today. In September 1939, the war Ethiopia had warned about finally arrived in Europe. By 1940, Italy formally joined the conflict on Germany's side, drawing its African colonies into the wider war. For Ethiopia's Arbegnoch, this was the opportunity they had waited 5 years for. British Empire forces, alongside Ethiopian patriots and exiled troops, launched the East African Campaign. Haile Selassie, still in exile, returned to the region to lead his people back into their own country. Ethiopian and allied forces fought side by side, pushing back Italian positions across the highlands. City by city, the occupation that once seemed permanent began to crumble. In early April 1941, Allied and Ethiopian forces liberated Addis Ababa, ending 5 years of Italian occupation. On May 5th, 5 years to the day since Italy's declaration of victory, Emperor Haile Selassie made his triumphant return to the capital. Ethiopia became the first nation occupied by fascist forces to be fully liberated during the Second World War. It was a moment of vindication for a leader who had once stood alone before an indifferent world. The emperor, who had warned Geneva that inaction would come back to haunt everyone, had lived to see his country free again. But the cost had been enormous, hundreds of thousands of lives, and years of occupation the world had allowed. Ethiopia's story became one of the earliest cautionary tales of the 20th century, and it raised a question that still echoes today. What happens when the world chooses to look away? After liberation, Ethiopia set out to rebuild and to redefine its role on the world stage. Haile Selassie became a leading voice for African unity, arguing that independence movements across the continent needed solidarity. In 1963, that vision took physical form. The Organization of African Unity was founded, headquartered in Addis Ababa. The choice of location was symbolic. This was the capital that had once fallen and then risen again. Today, that legacy continues. Addis Ababa is home to the African Union, the continent's leading political institution. Diplomats from 55 African nations meet there, in the same city Haile Selassie once had to flee. Ethiopia transformed from a cautionary tale of colonial aggression into a symbol of African resilience and unity. But the story leaves behind more than a monument. It leaves behind a warning. The League of Nations failed to stop a war it saw coming, and paid the price with a much larger, modern international institutions still wrestle with the same core question. What do you do when a powerful nation ignores the rules? Ethiopia's invasion is often called a footnote to World War II, but footnotes have consequences. 4 years before the war officially began, the warning signs were already there for anyone willing to look. The world chose not to look, and the world paid for it. This is why Ethiopia's forgotten war deserves to be remembered, Not as a side note, but as the true beginning. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. Words spoken in 1936 and still worth hearing now. What other forgotten countries do you want us to cover next? Subscribe to Gold Era History and join us for episode 2. Remember, history always has many different angles, and this is just one way to tell it. You can find our reference sources in the description below.